Election day has just passed, resulting in a sweeping victory by Democrats in Virginia, New Jersey, and New York City. Of particular note was the victory of Zoran Mamdani, an ethnically Indian Muslim and avowed social democrat in the city of New York. Obviously, people are quite divided on Mamdani winning. Most of the right, with the exception of the TRS crowd, are unhappy, even quite scared that a social democrat could win election. But I think their fears are rather hyperbolic and don't take stock of the real political situation in the West. The fundamental cause of these fears is the imaginative image of a communist revolution in the United States. As the narrative goes, social democrats are Marxists going the speed limit, and eventually, if enough of them get elected, they will start collectivizing production and setting up a dictatorship of the proletariat. I think this narrative is wrong for reasons I've already explained in other videos. Social democracy requires the market to function, and as such, social democrats won't be in a good position to actually ever abolish it. Reforms of this nature are, from an orthodox Marxist lens, somewhat reactionary because they reduce the immiseration caused under capitalism and thus make the revolution more unlikely. Even further, socially democratic reforms don't really interface with the actual productive relationships in society in any manner. Mamdani's policies involve preserving wages, just increasing them. He proposed raising the minimum wage to $30, which sounds absurdly high, but again, this is New York City we're talking about, where a small studio apartment might cost around $1,500 a month. It's very easy to get priced out of living there if you're on the lower end of the labor market. Of course, his other policies are similarly tepid. He wants to remove fares from city buses, something other cities have already done under liberals. He plans to freeze rent on rent-stabilized units and add additional affordable housing units. Again, policies other Democrats have advocated. Perhaps the only policy you could genuinely describe as socialist is his proposal for public child care, or his publicly funded grocery stores, which we'll get into later. Now, we might draw an allusion to Engels' belief that children ought to be raised communally, like in the Jewish kibbutzim. Socialists have always endeavored to accomplish something like this by gradually reducing the involvement of parents in the care of their own offspring, such as through the institution of public schools. But ultimately, this policy isn't the accomplishment of a socialist commune. Parents can still care for their children themselves if they want to. They do not actually have to use public child care, and private daycares will exist if they aren't rendered unprofitable by the public option. Another policy that somewhat resembles communist policy is the introduction of state-owned grocery stores with fixed prices. However, semi-nationalization of retail isn't new. Liquor control states have state-owned liquor stores, and this has hardly produced communism. Ultimately, this isn't really even a communist policy in the Marxian sense. It's an example of state capitalism and has nothing to do with the collectivization of business. Lastly, he proposes tax increases on corporations and individuals earning more than $1 million annually. But again, liberals often advocate for the same thing, and progressive income taxes are not the same thing as the overthrow of the bourgeoisie. That these taxes are necessary is really just proof of how reliant on market actors democratic socialist policies are, since to actually acquire money for their programs, they need to skim off corporations and CEOs. If there were no corporations, there wouldn't be a solid economic basis for said programs unless businesses were nationalized, in which case we're talking about state capitalism rather than communism. We can debate whether Mamdani's policies are ultimately beneficial for New Yorkers. Nearly all state-owned grocery stores that have been attempted in the US have closed due to unprofitability. But it seems that Mamdani's intentions for these stores are a bit different. What Mamdani's policy basically boils down to is a state subsidy on groceries meant to make living more affordable for the poor. If we don't expect these state-run stores to actually produce profit, but instead suppose that they are a kind of welfare system, the policy does sort of actually make some sense. In combination with his tax increases and the redirection of funds from the Fresh program, it may actually be sustainable. The only issue is that it may put smaller retailers out of business if they cannot outcompete the state-run stores in either prices or the availability of products. I imagine that state-run stores wouldn't have the expansive selection that private stores would have, so maybe this isn't a real issue. Time will tell whether ultimately the benefit these stores can have to the poor outweighs the damage it might cause to the petite bourgeoisie. As far as the potential of causing food shortages, I don't think this is a problem. Food supplies in the US are quite robust. The other policies are unlikely to cause many harmful externalities, and on the whole will constitute small benefits to poor New Yorkers. Perhaps the worst policy he supports is the protection of gender affirmative care, but we would generally expect that from a Democrat anyway. The upshot of Mamdani, and this is why he's based, is that he represents a popular decision on the Israeli-Palestine conflict. He has been a somewhat vocal proponent of the BDS movement and has called the war in Gaza a genocide. Ultimately, he isn't all that full bore on the problem and isn't really a perfect advocate for the Palestinian people, since he seems to toe the line about supporting a two-state solution. But nonetheless, he has been the most vocal opponent of Israel's war to actually successfully win an election. Now, we could argue that Mamdani doesn't have any actual direct control over U.S. foreign policy, but this indicates at least that the tide on Zionism is beginning to turn. I expect that as young people grow more and more weary of United States support for Israel, we will see greater gains by Democrats. If anything, I think the victory of Mamdani indicates that, at least in terms of foreign policy, we really have a better interest in supporting Democrats than Republicans, at least those Democrats who vocally reject Zionism. We can take for granted that an anti-Zionist right is nowhere in the cards, at least for the moment. If it's true that Nick Fuentes becomes the next Charlie Kirk, we might see a shift on the debate in the far future, and thus anti-Zionist conservatism might actually become viable. But for various reasons, I don't think it would actually gain institutional traction. Even if it did, I think the combination of anti-Zionism with free market policy is still unattractive. What passes for the right in the West at the moment is so devoid of principles, so wedded to an exploitative and globalizing system, and ultimately is so repulsive in terms of its de facto hatred of autonomy that I can't in good faith argue anyone should support them. And ultimately, even if you're a single-issue voter on demographics, the Republican track record is hardly better than that of the Democrats. Personally, I'm taking the Alain de Benoit pill, which is that I would rather vote for a communist than the sad joke that is the right wing in democratic politics. As such, I am generally rather positive on Mamdani's victory. The more irrelevant the conservative right becomes, the more impact principled identitarian metapolitics can have. If the people reject what the GOP has to offer, more austerity, more immigration, more compromise, then all that's left that can be the basis for a successful opposition party in the US is us. Because they're somewhat less bourgeois in economics, and because it accidentally benefits us, I think the right should start voting for Democrats. Zoran Mamdani is based, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise.